Hello, everybody, and welcome to the panel towards binding agreements on wages. Now, to address this important topic today, I'm delighted to welcome on stage Christina Clausen, Director for the Textile, Garment, Shoe and Leather sector at Industrial, Mira Neumaier, the Executive Director of ACT, Mick Bride, Senior Vice President of Corporate Responsibility and Global Affairs at PVH, and Adil Rehman, who is the Head of Human Rights at ASOS. We had also planned to have industry representation from Cambodia today. Unfortunately, Ken Liu, who is the Secretary General of the Textile, Apparel, Footwear and Travel Goods Association in Cambodia, has fallen ill and is unable to join us. So we wish him all well from the stage in Copenhagen. We're very pleased, however, that we do have a video contribution from Atith Kong, who is the president of the Cambodia Coalition of Apparel Workers Democratic Union. So we will watch that in the session. Now, as many of you in the audience are aware, garment worker wages continue to be a central challenge in the apparel sector. Attempts to increase wages for garment workers have failed to deliver the sustainable and sustained improvements in wages that we would like to see. Where wage increases have been achieved, these have rarely been in step with inflation and productivity increases, which we know, of course, create downward pressure on wages and working conditions. ACT, Action, Collaboration, Transformation, has worked to ensure that brands can support collective bargaining agreements and collectively bargained wages more specifically. Now, today, we will hear from our esteemed panel about a very important milestone they have recently reached in Cambodia, the first ever brand-supported collective bargaining agreement. And we will also hear more about the implications of this agreement on the issue of wages across the sector more widely. So now to the panel. Christina, I would like to start with you. So as Director for the Textile, Garment, Shoe and Leather sector at Industrial, could you tell us more about how Industrial is addressing the barrier to wages and working conditions in the garment supply chain?
So thanks, Olivia. It's a pleasure to be here with my panel and with all of you at the Global Fashion Agenda. I just want to start to say that this issue has been a systemic problem for garment workers throughout the world. And as Industrial, we have taken a real systematic approach specifically around collective bargaining. And just for many of you who might not know, collective bargaining is the process where trade unions and workers and employers get together to negotiate an agreement, which we call a CBA, a collective bargaining agreement. So for trade unions, collective bargaining and negotiations are our DNA. That's what we do. And so from the global union, the key part for us was to design a system, because there are barriers for garment workers. Traditionally, garment workers in the manufacturing sector earn the lowest wages within our own organization. So we had a mandate from our affiliates to raise garment worker wages. So we know that the unilateral, voluntary, and non-binding CSR auditing system never was really able to make systemic changes or improvements on wages. So when we were looking on how to address this, we looked at two parts. One was, how is the manufacturing actually set up? Who are the stakeholders? We like to use that word, stakeholders. Who are the stakeholders? And how can we change this system to make it a more equitable system? So we looked at the using collective bargaining, but supported by brands' purchasing practices. So there's actually, I would say, two pillars on how we think that the best way to break the barrier around wages and working conditions. So on the purchasing practice side, we identified the 5 greatest negative impacts of brands' purchasing practices on wages and working conditions. And we set about to, together with our brand colleagues, we set about to benchmark them and show improvements. So there's surveys that take place with internally with brands, and then also externally with suppliers, so we can actually measure how brands' purchasing practices have changed. That's one pillar. The second pillar is about collective bargaining. And collective bargaining, I think you should think of it as a mechanism, as a tool, a delivery mechanism on how brands can support higher wages. Because when you think about it, there's an industrial relations relationship between suppliers, so employers, and workers. And so how can you improve wages that way? So from Industrial, we looked at it to say, look, if you could take wages out of competition through industry-wide agreements, this is a way to close the wage gap, to get to a living wage. So we actually entered into individual MOUs, so in 2015 and 2016, individual MOUs with Act signatory companies. And the MOU is really specific because it's basically on establishing within the global supply chain freedom of association, collective bargaining, and living wages. So we have a framework that each individual brand signed, and that set forward how we've worked on this issue. I think also what's quite important in this transition and what we've been working on is actually the recent meeting at the ILO on the expert committee on wages, including living wages, where they were able to set recommendations. And in those recommendations from the expert committee, so it's a tripartite committee made up of government, trade unions, and employers, they acknowledged and recommended for living wage and wage-setting mechanisms that collective bargaining at a national level is actually what needs to happen so that workers can have a living wage. So I think that's really the focus of how we at Industrial and together with the brands through our MOU engaged in this process. Now we've come to a point where I think it's, I would say, a historic point, because now we're saying, look, there's a way for brands to support collective bargaining, not just by saying that in their code of conduct or on their website or on their CSR report, but it's really now a legally binding agreement that we have negotiated to support the collective bargaining process in Cambodia. And I think and they're supporting it through their purchasing practices. So I think there's, 4 main elements in this agreement that the brands will individually sign with Industrial. Volume commitment, sourcing incentive for suppliers, ring-fencing labor costs, so the wage component in the CBA can be properly paid for, and also a skills development fund. One thing around is the improvement of workers' skills in the sector that's quite important for our affiliates and for Industrial. So I would say that's where we are at this moment. I don't know if I've taken too much time, but try to set the scene for everyone. And I think I'll just end there. Is that
perfect? Yeah,
okay?
That's absolutely brilliant. Thank you, Christina. Mick, turning to you to think about the brand perspective, could you perhaps tell us more about why PVH has signed a legally binding agreement to support collective bargaining in your Cambodian supply chain?
Thanks, Olivia. Happy to, but can I first just take a quick moment to, if I may, applaud the work done in Cambodia by the Cambodian Suppliers Association and the coalition of unions that actually got the CBA to within an inch of being done. We expect it to be ratified in the coming days and weeks. I'm actually from, I don't know how many folks in the room are from a labour background or an industrial relations background. I'm actually from a labour rights background. I worked as a union negotiator in Ireland, and then I practiced labour law on the union side in the US. And CBAs are tough, right? Getting to a collective bargaining agreement is not easy. Getting to your first collective bargaining agreement where there's no previous relationship contractually between the parties is absolutely monumental. So I just want to, from a personal basis, express what an achievement this is that the parties on the ground have actually done. So then when they came to the brands and said, okay, to make this work in Cambodia, to actually make the collective bargaining agreement such that it can be delivered this is what we need from brands. And Christina's already outlined those 4 elements. And we felt as PVH, first of all, we try as hard as we can to take our human rights commitments very seriously. We want to be a leader in the field. So in that perspective, we felt that signing this legally binding agreement to support the collective bargaining agreement in Cambodia was the right thing to do. And it's, never the wrong time to do the right thing. Secondly, what this does is, and, it's no secret, this is public knowledge, that, not that many years ago, labour relations in Cambodia in the garment sector was quite fraught. And for those parties to go on this journey, a successful CBA actually brings stability, brings labour peace, and that's actually good for business because you have a more predictable environment in which you can operate. And then thirdly, our hope is that this sets an example which can be grown from this one example in Cambodia and actually set a different relationship in the supply chain between the various parties. And we believe at PVH that brands should play their part.
Excellent, thank you. And could we just drill down a little bit into the significance of these agreements being legally binding rather than the voluntary commitments that we're more familiar with?
Sure. I mean, I think from a PVH perspective, having it legally binding creates an accountability mechanism for all, right? We heard on a panel yesterday about, in a country that's not Cambodia, they're looking at, maybe wages will go up, but the fear is that the brands will leave the country. Well, if the brands sign a legally binding accountability mechanism that we're not going to leave the country if wages go up in line with the CBA, well, then that actually should give, in my view, accountability to all those parties. And look, I think, I really like listening to all the contributions on stage. I think they're great, but I think we can also admit that a common theme the last 2 days is that ambition will only get us so far, right? The difference is in the implementation. And what this does is it gives certainty in respect of these ambitions being implemented because everybody is accountable and accountable legally.
Lovely. We like accountability, so we're very happy about that. And Adil, could you perhaps tell us a little bit more about why the shift of responsible sourcing strategies towards supporting collective bargaining processes is so important for brands?
Yeah, hello, everyone. Yes, certainly. I think it's important for brands, but I think it's also important for the whole kind of industry as well, whether it's suppliers, factories, government. I think for all the industry stakeholders in Cambodia as well, and obviously workers in particular. I think for us, for ASOS, it's more of a transformation of the industry. I think we really want to address a real challenge, which, as you mentioned, was the wages, etc., but which we as a brand cannot through unilateral actions or programs, etc. Believe me, I've tried. We're not going to get far. And I think this is one where we're able to kind of focus on having collective bargaining agreements, which at the centre is crucial. It's like Michael just said as well, I think that's what was unique, and that's why ASOS was interested right at the start and is interested right now in supporting the process. I think the collective bargaining agreements, particularly in Cambodia, will allow workers and employers to negotiate tailor-made solutions to the challenges that they have to their industry there. But also the support for CBAs is key for us. It's key for brands as it allows us to play an active role in resolving and remediating, I think, the issues for workers. With the involvement of unions. And I think that's critical. And that's a critical element that I think that's going to ensure we make progress. And I think for ASOS, obviously, collective bargaining, in this format is a milestone. It has taken a long time, not going to lie to you. It's taken some time to get here. But I think for us, it's the best opportunity we have to change the industry into the industry we want. People say it a lot. And I think working closely with suppliers and factories and worker representatives, etc., to develop this approach, I think is definitely the way forward. I would also say, obviously for us, and it's a kind of thing finally, I mean, ASOS, we want a fairer, more transparent, more sustainable industry. I think throughout this engagement for ASOS, we're able to identify not only what is important in the industry, in Cambodia, etc., but importantly, how we're going to be able to ensure it's going to lead to successful implementation of all of the collective bargaining agreements that we will sign, hopefully from now and in the future.
Wonderful, thank you. And Mira, turning to some of the technicalities, could you perhaps tell us why ACT is focused on the development of these individual agreements?
Yeah, thank you, Olivia, and hello to everyone. Yes, I mean, we have heard from Christina that CBAs are basically the best and only way to ensure reliable and predictable wage increases. And we also heard from Mick that they ensure stability and predictability for the industry, right? And therefore, they, in general, lead to more certainty for all actors. And if this goes well, and if the very promising process in Cambodia has been finalized with a collective bargaining agreement, then this is what we mean when we talk about sound industrial relations, right? But these sound industrial relations also require stability and predictability in the supply chain. So therefore, we think these individual agreements signed by brands and industrial are basically the way forward and can serve as an important enabler for collective bargaining agreements. ACT has been established to address pervasive issues on wages and working conditions through a quite innovative approach, action, collaboration, transformation, with industrial relations and collective bargaining at the core. Because we all know that issues on wages and working conditions are in many ways systemic problems. I mean, it's already mentioned before, and this is what we need to address and what we would need to work on. And with these individual agreements, I think, and this is, I think, what you call technicality, we finally did find a way to address the complexity of the supply chain, but also the specific responsibility in these complex supply chains, and therefore hope that this can lead to real transformation. Lately, during the pandemic specifically, I think we have seen that, apologies, that risk is often not evenly distributed and shared within the supply chain, and often affects stakeholders in production countries more disproportionately. So therefore, we are really proud that we worked on something that is very much about making sure that the benefits and the overall interests of the different actors are reflected in this structure, as well as a more equitable risk-sharing approach here. And therefore, we would say that this is the first time that we could really ensure a more balanced approach regarding the overall benefits with regards to wages. I think we have seen that in some ways on health and safety with legally binding agreements, and this now for the first time could ensure the same dynamic and the same transformation with regards to wages. Therefore, we have a structure that is basically in two different elements, right? We have on one side the collective bargaining agreements negotiated by unions and employers. This is an ongoing and quite promising process in Cambodia. And on the other hand, we have the individual agreements signed by brands and industrial to support these collective bargaining agreements. I'm highlighting this because I know it's not really obvious at this point, and it's really important to understand the overall structure of these. And this is also what, at the end, makes it so innovative, because this has been developed in a tripartite approach together with brands, with employers, with unions, because it was important to acknowledge that we need tailor-made solutions, right? It's not just about general support and just, a voluntary commitment to say we are very much in favor of collective bargaining. It's about the specific support addressing the needs of the industry in Cambodia and the specific priorities of the social partners in Cambodia. And therefore, we think this could foster real change and is a win-win approach.
Lovely, thank you. Okay, so we're delighted to say that we now have a video statement from Ateeth Kong about the significance of these agreements for workers in Cambodia.
Good morning. Greeting from Cambodia. My name is Kong Ateeth. I am the president of Coalition Cambodian Apparel Worker Democratic Union called CICADU. We are representing more than 40,000 members in the garment industry. Today, I'm grateful to bring you a good opportunity to present you about the good development about the agreement between industry oil and the brand that support the collective bargaining agreement in Cambodia. And we are working very hard in this process with the ACT process that lead to this support, this CBA that promote the better wage and working condition. So this is the extraordinary development that could lead to bring the more peace and prosperity in the industry, promote better wage for the workers, and also promote more sustainability and competitiveness in the industry. This breakthrough agreement is the first time that we can bring all party that in the sector, in the supply chain, into this negotiation. So this is the legally binding, the first time legally binding that we achieve, and this is keep everybody in responsibility and also sitting in the good dialogue, social dialogue, promote better social dialogue in these sectors. From the Cambodian Union side, we are happy. We call you all the party to continue support this agreement and to make sure that the CBA will be finalized, and then we can achieve together and we can use this significant platform and breakthrough to promote the better working condition and better wages and competitiveness for the industry. Thank you.
Thank you to Ateeth. We can give him a round of applause from Copenhagen. Okay, so Christina, let's turn back to you and think about, from Industrial's perspective, why it's so necessary to take this unique step of the individual legally binding agreements.
I wouldn't say it's a unique step. Okay. For trade unions, our modus operandi is to negotiate legally binding agreements. That's what collective bargaining is about. But I think it is a unique step, using your words, in the supply chain. We have had important experience over the last 10 years where we've negotiated the legally binding Bangladesh Accord, which is now the international accord. So we were able to take the issue around occupational health and safety and building and fire safety and actually have the first supply chain industrial relations agreement on occupational health and safety. And I think from Industrial, we like that model. We think it's part of who we are. That's what our trade unions do. We think it's applicable in the supply chain. And I think this is, for Industrial, very important, especially when we're signing individual agreements with brands to have an accountability mechanism. And I think one thing that I kind of started a little bit in my earlier remarks was to say, we need to move from voluntary to legally binding. We've seen what's happened in the supply chain over the last 30 years. We all come to these events, we all talk about how things need to change. Well, this is a paradigm shift. I look at it as, from Industrial, it's a paradigm shift to move from voluntary to legally binding. Now, that is what the trade unions are doing, but there's also, along the way, regulation taking place throughout Europe, throughout the globe, I would say, on supply chains. So it is quite important for us as the trade union movement, and especially with multinationals, to have agreements that hold them accountable. Not, oh, we're going to do it, you have our word. No, we want your signature. We want that security, and workers need that security. I think the other thing that's very important is that it gives a level of transparency, right? There's an accountability mechanism built into all these agreements. I think that's quite important for human rights due diligence and for brands to have that accountability and to have that transparency that comes with legally binding agreements. And I think other brands, and I've heard it in other forums, that they said around the Bangladesh Accord, now the international accord, is like, we sign this and we're going to do it. And so I think that statement really speaks volumes for why these are quite important. And, we want to move away from philanthropic initiatives to real supply chain industrial relations. That's what's going to make the difference.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. Mira, can you perhaps say more about the impact you foresee these agreements having and whether or not you feel as though it sort of ushers in a new era of supply chain industrial relations?
Yes, thank you. I think we don't want to, overstate this, but we think the potential implications of these agreements are profound, right? So at this point, I mean, it might even sound, straightforward, or for some even obvious to say that brands should support a collective bargaining agreement. I mean, it has been mentioned before, but more specifically there as well, we have now the ILO recommendations on living wages, focusing very much on the importance of collective bargaining. We have a changing regulatory framework with mandatory HRDD obligations. Here we have also a focus on meaningful stakeholder engagement. So in a way, it is kind of obvious to say to support collective bargaining agreements should be a no-brainer, right? It is the right thing to do, and it is the most effective thing to do. But still formalizing this and formalizing the role that brands play in relation to industrial relations, because there is no formal role, right, was proven challenging. Let's be honest, that's not an easy process. And it took a while because there are no shortcuts. There are no shortcuts to industrial relations, and there are specifically no shortcuts to industrial relation in complex supply or value chains, right? And this step now taken by industrial and individual brands to really sign legally binding agreements to support a collective bargaining agreements, this basically means that we are now at a point that we can square the circle, that we can really find a solution to a problem that is almost ingrained in this industry and that we all try to solve for, for decades now. And therefore, we think they mark a significant milestone towards establishing a more equitable and also future-proof industry. And they can really encourage higher standards and better working conditions across the supply chain and show leadership, right, and commitment to improving the sector at this point. We call it a new era of supply chain industrial relations because it's the first transformation in the industry that is really driven by employers, unions, and brands. Right. And it should really highlight the innovative and pioneering nature of these agreements. We hope that this model can drive significant improvement in wages and working conditions, and therefore I think it's really important to acknowledge that this can foster sustainable change and therefore hopefully set a new standard in the industry.
Wonderful, thank you. Now turning back to the brand side to think about this future-proofing a bit more, how do you think these agreements can influence the role that brands can play future-proofing the sector?
Okay, so I think, to be honest, hearing everything, I don't want to say it's a no-brainer, but it is a no-brainer. But for ASOS, it certainly is a moment for us to look at where we are now and what we want to do in the future. And I think, we've got the potential to change the industry as a whole. ASOS has always said, that I think the individual efforts we've put in on wages to address wages within our own supply chains, etc., are okay, etc. But they're very limited. They're very limited and only to a certain point. And I think to be really effective and meaningful, I think brands have, ASOS has to look at, like how we want to change the industry, how we want to move beyond this kind of individual factory programs, and we want to collaborate with employers and unions. And that's important for us as well. And I think the individual agreements with Industrial as well, I think, for ASOS, they're a link to a kind of a collective bargaining process in Cambodia that brings together a very kind of clear mechanism for change with commitments by brands. And as Michael said about the legally binding bit, for ASOS as well, I think it's really important. That enforceable commitment is there. We know we've got to do it, and we want the transparency as well. ASOS wants that as well. And I think, I know we say about future-proofing the sector, etc., but we have to address these structural inadequacies. We have to ensure workers and employers are at the core. I think we have to set a new standard, particularly now. And for ASOS, I think that standard is going to allow us as well to have a lot of other benefits. For example, proactively meet investor, human rights due diligence kind of legislation, the current legislation that's already in place, but more importantly, forthcoming legislation as well. So I think, for ASOS as a brand, I think supporting the collective bargaining agreement allows a more meaningful stakeholder engagement. It's an entire project that is driven by unions and workers. And they have to be at the core of it again. And I think supporting it for ASOS ensures that not only are those stakeholders kind of consulted, but the perspectives, their interests, their understandings are integral to the overall approach. And that's the only way we can move forward.
Wonderful, yeah, absolutely. Mick, perhaps you could tell us a little bit more about what you think it will take to ensure the success of these agreements and also, because it's the theme of the summit, unlock the next level.
Yeah, so I'll leave the theme of the summit to the moderator if I can. But I think it's quite a simple question, right, in terms of how can we succeed. And I think, you know, when I look at this, Olivia, right, it's quite simple. We have a CBA agreement now in Cambodia between the suppliers and the unions. We now have a legally binding support agreement between Industrial and each individual brand. So the architecture is there. It's in place. It's done. It wasn't easy, but it's done, right? The question now, how do we make it a success? And quite frankly, that's why we're all here. Now we have to adopt it and scale it. We have to get it to scale, right? And we need as many brands as possible to sign the legally binding agreement with Industrial, and we need as many factories as possible to sign the CBA with the unions. And the more brands that sign the legally binding agreement to say we're going to support this, the more factories will sign the CBA. So that's why we're out talking to brands to say this makes sense, not just from a human rights perspective, not just from a human rights due diligence perspective, but from a good business perspective. This makes sense. And, you know, Christina mentioned the accord. I recall in 2013, when we were negotiating the accord, I actually was on the Labour side at the time. I hadn't switched horses yet, so to speak. But I remember when we got the accord agreement done, we were aiming for 20 brands. We were hoping for 40, and we got 220. And I think it's pretty indisputable that the Bangladesh Accord, as it then was, you know, undeniably altered the employment rights situation in Bangladesh, health and safety and beyond. And I think that's what we're aiming for. We're aiming to get this done at scale. And I suppose just one last point, if I may. I was listening yesterday to the, I thought, remarkable keynote by Paul Pullman. And in that keynote, he asked a question to the audience in which I was sitting yesterday. And he said, "Do you care?" And I would ask that same question today. And I mean, I know there's folks in the hall who work for brands and have influence at brands. I know there's people online watching this right now who work at brands and have influence at brands. We now have a CBA in Cambodia. We know from the actors on the ground what it takes to support that CBA to make it a success. We now have a legally binding agreement that each brand can sign with Industrial to give effect to that. So I would repeat Paul's question to everyone here who has influence in the industry. Do you care? Because you can either sit here, go through this few days, have a nice time in Copenhagen, or sit in your office and watch online, leave, forget about it, and come back next year and we'll have the same conversation. Or you can do something about it if you care.
I think the message is clear. Thank you. Thank you, Mick. And Christina, over to you for the last word. Please, on what you feel from Industrial's perspective it will take, same question, to ensure success and unlock the next level.
Well, you know, to follow up on Mick's point, do you care? I think that is the question. And I think brands should go back internally, those who are sourcing from Cambodia, and ask that question, because we have been, you know, I've been with Industrial for about 10 years now. I've been in so many of these meetings where we've talked about how do we increase wages, how do we pay more to workers in our supply chain. Now we're at the moment where we've taken a really significant step to pull together a tripartite set of negotiations on a global level, on a national level, in line now, I would say, with the ILO recommendations from the expert committee on wage setting, including living wages. So these forces that are, you know, from the international standards and from brands, you know, a lot of you talk about you're on your journey, your living wage journey. Well, let me tell you, here's a way to accelerate that. You've collected the data, you've done your due diligence, you've collected information. Now it's really the implementation of that. And I think, we have brands who have been, in the leadership in this industry, moving this issue forward, who are signing individual legally binding agreements with Industrial to support collective bargaining. So I again call from Industrial and our affiliates in Cambodia, call on all brands who are sourcing in Cambodia to come forward, sign the agreement with us, and then let's take that next step together.
Wonderful, thank you. Again, I think the message is clear. So we're going to wrap up there. I just want to say a huge thank you to everyone for joining us here today, the panel, and of course on video to join the panel, Do You Care? Legally binding agreements on wages. And there's clearly a huge milestone in the efforts to address wages and working conditions in the garment supply chain. And we really do call on all brands sourcing from Cambodia to consider signing these agreements to support the broadest possible implementation. So please join me in thanking the panel and congratulating everyone on their hard work, and it's off to you.